Welcome everybody. I'm Joe Merrill, president of the Petaluma Museum. We're at Flight, the exhibition, and this is part of our speaker series. Try to get them in as many Saturdays as possible, and to me that's really kind of the most important aspect of the exhibit is hearing these great speakers and tell these stories and kind of immerse ourselves in really what happened in the days of World War II. And obviously there was a lot of amazing air battles that took place, and some of them were a little more famous than others, but not less important. So you're going to hear a great tale today. Our speaker, Roberto de Haro, retired professor, local author. He wrote the book Assassin's Raid, and that'll be on sale after his presentation. So with no further ado, Mr. de Haro.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm going to tell you a little bit of background information with respect to why I decided to write this book, which I call Assassin's Raid. There have been some very significant stories written about key battles that took place in the Pacific during World War II. And many of you have seen motion pictures. You've probably read stories that detail the Doolittle Raid, that also detail the Battle of Midway. And of course, you've probably heard of books like Berdasky's book, Guadalcanal Diary. Much of the information about these battles and about the conflict that occurred in the Pacific has also been captured on film. So there are a tremendous number of documentaries and some significant commercial films that have been made available. Much like you were watching the Memphis Belle behind me a little while ago, you can think of films that Van Johnson made, 20 Seconds Over Tokyo, about the Doolittle Raid, the more recent one, Pearl Harbor with Ben Affleck. So we have quite a bit of information about those very important and very significant battles that took place. This story that I'm going to talk to you about is probably just as important, if not more important, than those battles that took place. Why? Well, it changed the course of the Japanese naval battles toward us. And for about 2-3 weeks after his death, after Admiral Yamamoto's death, the Japanese Navy came to a halt. That was how significant he was. So the book is really about the raid that the United States made to shoot down Admiral Yamamoto in 1943. So why kill Admiral Yamamoto? I mean, who was he? What's his significance? All right, let me talk to you a little bit about this very famous Japanese admiral, probably the second most famous admiral in Japanese history. Admiral Togo, who defeated the Russians at the Battle of Tsunami Straits, is probably the foremost Japanese naval commander. And right behind him is Yamamoto, who probably was as smart and maybe even smarter. Yamamoto was not born Yamamoto. He was born to the son, he was born as the son of a samurai former warrior. And in Japan, if you lost your patron, and if you were no longer a samurai, you became what they called a ronin. And so that's what his father was. He was a ronin, and they were very poor. He was born in a very remote region of Japan, very close to the Sea of Japan. It's a very harsh land, and born into this very poor family. However, when he went to school, he was brilliant. He was at the top of his class. So what was not unusual in Japan in those days, and remember he was born in the 1880s, so when he excelled in school, this very powerful and wealthy Japanese family, the Yamamotos, offered him a deal. They said, we will adopt you so that you will have the Yamamoto name and the fortune behind you. But there's only one condition for our adoption, and that's that you sire a male son. So he said, fine. And sure enough, later on he married, and he did have male offspring. Yamamoto went to the Japanese Naval Academy and graduated 5th in his class. He then was with Admiral Togo when they defeated the Russian fleet. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand. Now, when you see the film Pearl Harbor, and I know many of you have seen it, it'll probably be on television again, and watch it when you do. Mako, the actor who they get to play Yamamoto, crosses his hands like this, and he's got all of his fingers. So you can see immediately that there's an error there. Whereas in Tora Tora Tora, which is the story of the Japanese raid against Pearl Harbor, the actor is wearing a glove, which Yamamoto always wore, to try to hide the fact that he had lost these 2 fingers. What was it about Yamamoto that made him so brilliant? Well, first of all, he was a top student. Second of all, he was very creative, probably on the verge of genius. He had developed the idea that, and this was back in the 1920s, he had developed the idea that aerial warfare was going to be the key linchpin for the Navy. And at that time, the prevalent theory in the Navy world was that the battleship was the big thing. And of course, the British and the Germans and the Japanese all adhered to the theory that the battleship was unsinkable. Not so, thought Yamamoto. He said that anything that floats can be sunk. And he thought that the airplane would be an extension of the way in which firepower was carried to the enemy. Now, for the longest time, aircraft carriers operated independently. Even if there was a flotilla that included a couple of carriers, they pretty much operated independently. He thought completely different. He said they have to work in a coordinated way, and they have to be under the general command of one person. So you can begin to see that here was a real serious thinker, an individual who looked at naval warfare in a completely different perspective. What also made Yamamoto very intriguing was he actually came to the United States on several occasions and studied at Harvard. He was very well liked by American military attachés in Washington and in New York. Why? He was very gregarious, very friendly. He was a great poker player. And he was also a fantastic gymnast. So on his frequent trips to the United States as a naval attaché, he would take ships from Japan that were basically loaded with Americans, with Europeans, and with English people. And so he enjoyed our company. He liked our institutions, and he had a great deal of respect for this country. So what happened to him? Well, here's a man who achieved enormous success in Japan, who modernized their Navy. He's the one who talked Nakashima Industries into building the Zero. And had they listened to him, and had they put in sealed gas tanks and more armor for their fighters, they would have been a lot more successful than they were. He also helped them design a long-range 2-engine bomber. So not only was he an individual of great acumen from a military perspective, but he was also a very well-educated, a very humanistic person. He wrote poetry. And he had a mistress, even though he married this woman who was taller than he was and a little older than he was. That was not his main love. His main love was a geisha woman who he had met in a district in Japan and became very fond of, and he would write her poetry. And she actually became the love of his life. Probably the last person he thought about before he died was probably Chill, who was his lover. So here we have this brilliant admiral. Now, there's a negative perspective that surrounds Yamamoto that most of us have gleaned from the early war propaganda toward the Japanese. There were 2 people who we vilified in addition to the Emperor of Japan. One of them deserved it, and that was Hideki Tojo. But Yamamoto did not deserve it. He had been cast as a buck-toothed individual with horn-rimmed glasses who wanted to march the Japanese army into Washington, D.C. to force a truce. That was not the case with him. When he was asked by Prince Fumimaro, who at that time was like their Secretary of State, and this was before the attack on Pearl Harbor, he said, the prince asked him, what are our chances against the Americans and the English? And he looked at the prince and he kind of laughed and he said, we can kind of play hell with the Americans for about a year. He said, but after that, he said, we're going to lose. He knew that the United States had superior machinery. It had an industrial base that Japan did not. And if it put its mind to it, this country could overwhelm almost any enemy that attacked it. So he knew from the very inception, and he tried to talk the Japanese military out of this foolishness of attacking the United States and the British. And he was threatened with assassination for that. And on several occasions, he was actually shot at. And one time, somebody tried to kill him in the night because they thought that he was a defeatist. But he really was a realist. He understood that fighting the United States would only lead to defeat for Japan. All right. When I decided to look at what had happened to this man and why he became a target, you have to consider two things. Think about the attack on Pearl Harbor. How many of you have seen the film Tor, Tor, Tor? We pretty much knew that the Japanese were going to attack us. And Colonel Braddock, who was with the Army, and his Navy counterpart knew that the Japanese were going to attack. They didn't quite know whether it was going to be in the Philippines or whether it was going to be at Wake Island. The worst case scenario was that they would attack at Pearl Harbor because that would really be devastating. Now we attribute the attack to Yamamoto, that he planned it. He commissioned the attack. He did not plan it. He commissioned the attack. His whole approach was, what's the worst thing we could do to the Americans to stop them? And that was to destroy their carriers and their fleet at Pearl Harbor. So what he did was he turned to a very brilliant strategist, Minoru Genda. And Genda was his chief air officer, a very brilliant man who eventually became an admiral of the Japanese Navy and who wrote a wonderful biographical story about Yamamoto. Well, he commissioned Genda to do the plan. And it was a devastating plan because all of the right elements were there, and we just failed to take advantage of the kind of intelligence that we were receiving. And then, of course, we had a Secretary of the Navy at the time who was not very quick on his feet. And this individual who was Secretary of the Navy never got over the fact that Pearl Harbor had happened on his watch. And after Pearl Harbor, he was not demoted, but all the concerns, all of the policy and all of the major decisions for the Navy were taken away from him, and they were given to an admiral. So here was a man who was smarting because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and who had taken it personally, and who looked at Yamamoto as the villain, the man who had caused him shame. Well, along comes the war. The Japanese attack, and we gradually begin to realize that the Japanese Navy really is built around one man. The commander-in-chief of the Japanese fleet is Yamamoto. And think of how brilliant this man was. We think of the attack on Pearl Harbor as the key point of the war in the Pacific at its inception. But Yamamoto said no. He said that's not it. It's got to be more than that. So what did he do? He also planned simultaneous attacks on the British in Singapore and down the Malayan Peninsula, and on the Americans in the Philippines, and also to take Wake Island and Samoa. So his conception of a war at sea was something that was way beyond what we had realized. And he was very successful at it. And so to prove his theory that the battleship was not the premier weapon on the seas, he decided that 2 attacks would demonstrate the ability of naval air to win the battles. Pearl Harbor was one, but the one that we don't hear about, and the English are very reluctant to share this with us because they're so proud of what they have done on the sea. How many of you have ever seen the film Sink the Bismarck? Now remember that in that film, the German battleship, the Bismarck, huge monster ship, was sunk by British naval gunfire. But it had destroyed one of the two premier British battleships, the Hood. The other one, the Prince of Wales, managed to get away. Well, what really sank the Bismarck were these biplanes that the British used to drop torpedoes. What it did was it damaged the rudder on the Bismarck, and it could only steam in a circle. And so then the British destroyed it by using their cruisers and their heavy guns of one of their battleships. When the war in the Pacific was going to come to fruition, and it was going to become a major contest, the British sent their premier battleship, the Prince of Wales, to Singapore. It was their way of telling the Japanese, we have an enormous battleship here, and you don't want to fool with us. It took the Japanese Navy, their naval aviators, but 6 hours to sink it. And of course, the British don't like to talk about this. So here you have, therefore, an individual who had this almost global perspective with regard to the war, especially the naval war that we were engaged in. He was, therefore, someone that if we could get to, just the way the British wanted to kill Rommel in North Africa, he was someone that if we could get to and knock out, we just might shorten the war. Now, we've heard a great deal about the cryptographers during World War II. And they were amazing. They were really the guys who helped us win the war. Because they were able to break both the German and the Japanese military codes. So, on one day in early April of 1943, American cryptographers deciphered a message that had been sent by the Japanese Naval Command indicating that Admiral Yamamoto was going to visit an advanced post near Bougainville, only 400 miles away from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. At first, when this message was relayed to Washington, D.C. and verified, and Yamamoto was very specific, and he was a stickler for timetables, and you'll see all of this in the book. He even had his chief aide, Watanabe, do everything down to the last second. And he knew exactly how long he would be in the air and where he would be in the air, so that when the Americans deciphered the code and looked at it, they knew exactly where he was going to be. All right. The decision was made because the head of the Navy went to see President Roosevelt and told him, here's the guy who caused the raid on Pearl Harbor. He's within our grasp. If we kill him, we can slow down the Japanese substantially. And it may mean the difference between whether we win the war in a hurry or we drag it out. And Roosevelt did not like the idea. He and General Marshall, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had talked about it. And Marshall knew Yamamoto. They had become friends. And Marshall weighed the decision from two perspectives. On the one hand, Marshall said, we're going to have to make peace with the Japanese. And it will be impossible to make peace with the Japanese by dealing with someone like Tojo. Because Tojo was one of those military hotheads. He was crazy. Whereas Yamamoto was rational. He was someone we could reason with, who understood us, and who realized that eventually there was a war. So why not keep him alive so we would have somebody we could negotiate with, someone who would come around to our perspective. But Roosevelt told him, no, let's do this. So the decision was made, and it was sent to the Navy at Guadalcanal, to the Navy and to the Marines. And that's where you have a very interesting little inter-service conflict. Why? Well, it was a Navy operation. The Navy had the information, they had gotten first, and they'd gotten permission from the Secretary of the Navy to do this. But the problem was the Navy didn't have a plane that could go the distance to rendezvous with Yamamoto's plane and shoot it down. Who had the plane to do it? The Army. They had the P-38, which if they put extra fuel tanks on it, could make the trip and back. Ooh. You'll see in the book the rivalry between the forces. Now, the commander of the squadron that was given the mission, a fascinating guy, Mitchell. I talked to him before he died. Just a charming man from Oregon. Very pleasant, very friendly, very open, but bitter. Not a bitter man toward other people, but bitter to what had happened to his men. And I'll tell you about that a little later. When the decision was made to go ahead and intercept Yamamoto's plane and shoot it down, it went to the Army. Because they had the P-38 and they had the training. So there have been a number of documentaries made. The History Channel is one that has made a real good documentary about that raid to knock down Yamamoto. I want you to think about something that made this raid so unusual. They had a 2-minute window of opportunity to shoot down Yamamoto's plane in the air. 2 minutes. That's all they could do because of the limited fuel supply that they had. And because he was going to be escorted by 6 Zeros. And the air base he was landing at had another squadron of Zeros there. Now the P-38 was a great airplane, but it could not mix it up in a dogfight with a Zero. They had a zooming tactic that would enable the P-38 to come at the Japanese Zero from out of the sun. And they had a much better gun platform because the guns were all ahead of the pilot. They were not in the wings, they were right ahead of the pilot, the way that the guns on the Sabre jets were. So it was a much better gun platform. And they also had cannon. As I mentioned earlier, most of the Japanese Zeros did not have gas tanks that were sealable or armor to protect the pilot. So it had to be done in a very quick and careful way. Now, think about what you have in your cars now if you do have a GPS system. It's a precise system. It enables us to go from a point to point B precisely because we use satellite control mechanisms. They didn't have that in those days. What they had to do was figure everything out mathematically with a slide rule. And of course, that kind of navigation was tricky. They had to consider the weight of the aircraft, they had to consider the extra fuel. And now let's make matters a little more complicated. In order to avoid Japanese radar, they had to fly at no more than 50 feet above the water. And they could not use a direct route. They had to use a series of turns that would take them away from Japanese picket ships that tended to congregate in a particular area. So this was a very complicated assignment, and anything could go wrong. You could run into a rain squall, and that would throw you off. You could be spotted by a Japanese plane, and that would ruin the whole thing. So here are these men, back in 1943, with simple mathematics, compasses, and slide rules, planned a mission 400 miles away to intercept a plane in the air and shoot it down. Remarkable. Did it work? Yeah. They did it. So the book is a story about how they did it. But there was a terrific controversy in the book afterwards. Why? Well, first of all, we did not want to let the Japanese know that we had broken their code, that we knew exactly what they were saying. Therefore, if the success of the raid got out and people learned that it was because we had broken the code, the Japanese would change it immediately. And that's what set us back a bit. The second thing is that any of the pilots who returned from that flight could no longer be put at risk for the Japanese capturing them. So something had to be done with them. All right. The raid went off as expected. However, two of the planes never made it. One of them blew a tire taking off from the runway. And the other one developed a problem with the feeding of fuel from one of the auxiliary tanks of the engine. Had to turn around and go back. Here these men were in a plane that was designed to fly at about 20,000 feet, skimming along the tops of the waves at around 50 feet. Now this is in the tropics, and they're flying over open water. The temperature in the planes were up in the 90s, close to 100. And if you look at the canopy of P-38, the sun is just right on top of it. They were perspiring. They were wearing a parachute. They were wearing a Mae West. It was probably the most miserable few hours that they were committed to. And all the time, nervous, wondering, are we going to see a Japanese picket ship? Will the Japanese flight spot us? Are we on time? Are we in the right trajectory? Will we find these guys? Okay, let's jump forward a bit. The flight, of course, was a success. They managed to intercept and knock down both of the bombers that were being escorted. And when they came back, they were told, under no circumstances are you to break radio silence. We do not want the Japanese to realize that we had advanced information about where this admiral was going to be. Unfortunately, and you have to excuse pilots, especially fighter pilots. They're a rare breed. They're very aggressive. That's the way we want them. And they are individuals who can sometimes be grandstanders. For any of you who have seen the film with Robert Redford, The Great Waldo Pepper, classic example of a fighter pilot. A little bit of showman in them, risk takers. Well, one of them, Lampbeard, was a Stanford graduate, was a journalist, and he and Rex Barber were the two who were credited with shooting down Yamamoto. Well, before Lampbeard landed, he broke radio silence just as he was approaching Henderson Field, and he said, "We got him, we got the son of a bitch." And that started the controversy. Barber came in behind him a little later on, and by that time, Lampbeard had already called a press conference and was telling people that he had shot down Yamamoto's plane. Well, when Barber got to the press conference, he was a little late, and he heard what Lampbeard had said, and he kind of took it for a while until finally he told me, he said, "I just got tired of this guy flapping his lips over this thing." So I said, "What makes you think that you're the one who shot him down?" Well, that started the controversy. And the controversy was not settled until about 10 years ago, when the Air Force held the final of about 5 investigations to find out who actually shot down Yamamoto. I won't tell you who did it. You have to read the book to find out. That created, therefore, a tension between these two men who had been good friends before, between Barber and Rex Barber was one of those individuals who was a great pilot, but he was not a showboater. Lampbeard was a showboater, but he was also a good pilot. So those personalities clashed, and they never became friends again. They kind of tolerated each other, but they never became friends. Well, Lampbeard went one step farther, which caused even more trouble. He had political ambitions. He knew that if he could get the credit for downing Yamamoto in this daring raid, which was going to be suppressed until the end of the war, that after the war, he could run for office and be elected and be a national hero. Gosh, there'd be all kinds of things that would be possible for him. So he got together with a publicist and with an admiral. With a brigadier general after the raid, and they were talking about how to prepare a press release on knocking down Yamamoto. Well, fortunately, before that press release ever got sent, a copy of it was sent to the Naval Intelligence Office. And they about went through the roof then, because they did not want any information about this raid to get out. They knew that it would compromise their ability to continue to break the Japanese naval code. When the information was made available to Admiral Halsey, what had happened before was that each of these men was going to receive the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Navy Cross. And the ones who were in the killer element, in other words, the ones who would actually shoot down the airplane, they were all going to get the Congressional Medal of Honor. Well, when Halsey found out that Lampbeard and this other guy were going to put out a press release, he blew. And Halsey was one of those individuals who never missed words and whose vocabulary was filled with scattershot. And so he read the riot act of these guys. And he was so angry with them, he said, "You're not going to get the Congressional Medal of Honor because you did the following and you, Lampbeard, broke radio silence." He said, "You'll get the Navy Cross, but that's it." He said, "And I never want to see you guys again." And of course, that set really badly with the commander, with Mitchell. He never forgot that. He thought that this Navy admiral had really overstepped himself. They all deserved, he thought, the killer group all deserved the Congressional Medal of Honor. It's a hell of a thing that they did. And then, of course, the controversy between these two men. And so it weighed really heavy on Mitchell's mind, and he was never happy with it. So here you have a wonderful story, something that Hollywood eventually will come to grasp, and someone like Spielberg or Lucas will get the idea in their head. And they'll say, "Wow, this is an enormously wonderful story, and we may have to do a film about it." So that'll be forthcoming sometime later in the future. And what I want all of you to realize is what the context was for this book. Now, the book really is two parallel stories. On one hand, I created a fictitious character who would be part of this squadron. And he's a young man who comes from the Midwest. His parents are from Bowling Green in Kentucky. And he's going to Purdue. Now, people have asked me, why send him to Purdue? Why not to one of the big schools like Michigan or to one of the Ivy Leagues? How many of you know about Amelia? Okay, where did she put her plane together? Purdue. That's the place. They have a wonderful aeronautics program, and that's where she put her plane together. So I decided to lodge him there because they had such a fine aviation program. Now, in the book, you follow the story of this young man. He delays his entry into the Army so that he could finish his junior year at Purdue. And then you follow him as he goes through his training. First, his officer's training program, and then as he goes from two different air bases, flight school and then fighter pilot school. And you get a feeling in the book for what it was like then. What it was like to go through what I call the brown shoe army. Because in those days, the shoes for all the guys in the Army were brown. Now, Army, Navy, Air Force, they all wear black shoes. The other thing is, there are little pieces in the book that for any of you who have been veterans, or are veterans and have been in the military, you'll understand. And I'll give you an example. When they were running recruits through, you had to issue them boots and shoes. And there were people who were actually in the quartermaster service who could look at you and they could tell what size shoe you were wearing. So there's a vernacular in the book that some of you will chuckle about, where somebody says, "I wear a 9.5 shoe." And of course, the corporal and the quartermaster said, "You'll take what I give you and like it." And he said, "This ain't no Florsheim's and these ain't no Buster Browns." Okay, for those of you who are older, you know what Buster Browns were. Very nice shoe, and of course Florsheim was the expensive shoe in those days. It was the first shoe company, I think, who had the nerve to charge over $100 for a pair of shoes. So you're going to see these things, you're going to read this in the book, and you're going to say to yourself, "My God, this guy's done a lot of work, or else he's been through this process before." Both. A great deal of research, and also having gone through that whole military experience. So what was the outcome of the raid? What happened? Aside from the bitterness that it caused. In Japan, when news that Yamamoto had been killed reached the mainland several weeks later, it was like a day of national mourning. They had the largest parade, almost 5 million people attended it, when his ashes were brought back. And the ashes were cut in half. Half of them were sent to the Yamamoto family gravesite, and the other half were sent to this military cemetery where Admiral Togo's ashes were, and Yamamoto's ashes were put right next to him. Moreover, the parade in Japan for Yamamoto was changed. The route was changed so that it would pass right in front of the home of his mistress. Interesting story. All right. Now, for those of you who have heard a great deal about the war in Europe, friends of mine have asked me, how come you didn't do something about the war in Europe? Well, I did. This book, which came after that one, is a story about the Americans in Europe and how we began to work with the British, with the English, in attacking the Germans and knocking out their industry. But more importantly, it's really a love story about these two characters who appear in a previous book of mine. But how this young man who is from Louisiana and becomes a general in the Air Force, how he begins to see important changes that need to be done in order for our fighters to escort the B-17s all the way to Berlin and back. So you learn a great deal about aerial warfare in both of these books. That one in the Pacific and this one in Europe. Okay, I've talked enough at you. I'll entertain questions if you have them. Yes?
I heard a story, I think it was about Billy Mitchell, and trying to convince, this is somewhere between 1913 and 1921, that the airplane could actually take a ship.
He proved
And
it.
that they did it right in front of a Japanese admiral and a German admiral, and this is where, which is quite embarrassing because they took it up there to us. Is that true?
Yes. In fact, after the war, after World War I, we rounded up some of the major German fleet vessels, and Mitchell actually flew over them, bombed them, and sank them.
The story went that he wanted a big bomb. Says, no, you got a small bomb. So fine, I'll do a small bomb.
Right.
No, well, he beside his ship, not the ship, but just put beside it. Because they laughed him off.
That's why he got court-martialed. There were two very important,
That's what I heard.
yeah, it's true. There were two very important American military men who had this perspective. Billy Mitchell was one of them. Mitchell was also very outspoken. I don't know if you've ever seen the film with Gary Cooper, The Court-Martial of Billy Mitchell, with Rod Steiger. It's a wonderful film, and you'll get enough insight and background so that you can see that here's a man who understood. He was way ahead of his time. The other one was a man by the name of Benjamin Felice, and he and Mitchell couldn't stand each other, perhaps because they thought too much alike, but they were rivals. And so during World War I, Felice is the one who developed the air service, and he's the one who created what we call our fighter wings, and Billy Mitchell created our bomber wings. So you can see where the two of them would clash later on. But it's very true. Mitchell knew back in 1913 that the whole theory of the unsinkable ship was just a myth, and he proved it. And to make it even better, he said, we don't even have to hit it. He said, if we drop a large enough bomb next to it, the concussion will break through the hull and sink it. And he was right. So that's a very interesting facet of history.
But a Japanese admiral witnessed the whole thing. Story.
Well, like I said, Yamamoto was way ahead of his time.
I remember the strategy, the noise of the B-17 coming over Berlin. We were hoping they are coming, and we couldn't wait for them to come. Of course, we were in the midst of it, but we always had the feeling it's not for us, it's for the others. So forever and ever we are very, very grateful for the Americans and then the English. But I remember the noise of those motors.
Oh, yes. There was a schism between the English and the Americans. And it's important to make the distinction. The English, after the Battle of Britain, developed what they called a rodeo tactic. And their rodeo tactic was to send masses of planes and bombers, what they called a big wing, against the Germans. Well, the Germans shot them down in such large numbers that they stopped doing it. But what they did then was they switched to bombing at night. And of course, when you bomb at night, it doesn't matter in those days. You would only be able to drop bombs in a particular area. And the Americans said, we're not going to drop bombs at night because they're going to hit civilians. And we don't want that. We're after basically German industry. And incidentally, there's going to be collateral damage. We're going to kill civilians. But if you area bomb, you're going to kill everybody. For those of you who may have read the book Slaughterhouse-Five, in it, they talk about the bombing of Dresden. It was absolutely unnecessary. There was no reason to bomb Dresden, but the British were determined that they were going to bomb Dresden and reduce it to rubble to punish the Germans. We never did that. We had specific military targets or industrial targets in sight. And if we dropped bombs on a civilian group, it was secondary. It was by accident, not by intention. In fact, it cost us a great deal of trouble during Normandy, because many of our pilots who were dropping off the paratroopers there were told, if you see large concentrations of flak and shooting coming at you, drop those guys wherever you can, away from those concentrations. So the poor 82nd Airborne ended up in Saint-Mary-en-Gelès, right in the center of the town, where all the Germans were waiting for them. So it's a tragedy in a way, but you have two sides of the story. You going to ask something?
I ask you a question you can't answer because I don't know who would know. The Doolittle raid plan was to continue on after dropping their bombs in mainland China. If that same philosophy had been taken on the Yamamoto raid, they wouldn't have worried about getting back to Henderson Field. They could have chased after him and done other stuff. So one happened earlier in the war, one happened later in the war. All of a sudden we got very moral in the whole issue.
We had a plane that could make the trip and back.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
That was the first thing. The second thing is there was no place to go
Right.
for 400 miles. They would end up in the ocean.
So they sacrificed themselves. I mean, as did the guys who flew the Doolittle raid.
That's right. I actually interviewed Jimmy Doolittle through his daughter. I was working on the Monterey Peninsula. I was putting together a new university there. And that's where he lived. He lived in Carmel. And every year, just around the time that the Doolittle raid took place, the remaining pilots would fly over his home. So I got to talk with him and asked him about that, about the raid. A wonderful man. He said he had been a real crazy man when he was younger. He had been a real risk taker, a very daring person. And he was in his 40s when he did the raid. And he had been told by the head of the Army Corps, by Hap Arnold, don't do it.
Yeah.
You see them off and then you come back. But no. He said, I don't know.
Yeah.
When I asked him about the raid, Assassin's Raid and all that, he said, my hat's off to those guys because, he said, I don't think we could have done it flying at wave tops the way those guys did it. He says, and then catch somebody in the air. He said, a minute or two, that's nothing. He said, all it would take is 1 degree of difference in your navigation and you would never see it. And then the chances of knocking it down in the air.
Didn't they just find it in the jungles in Polycanal a couple of years ago?
Well, they actually found the wreckage not too long ago, but the Japanese knew where it was because they'd gone in to get him out.
Okay.
And it was actually discovered by a native, and then he told the Japanese lieutenant. Yamamoto's friend was his aide-de-camp, Watanabe. And Watanabe was the one who wrote most of his biography. and got together with Norugenda to make certain that the story about Yamamoto was accurate. And so that's what we use now. He was a remarkable man, and like I said, the comparison between him and Tojo was night and day.
Right.
If you've seen Tora Tora Tora, when you see Tojo depicted in there as a real hardliner, he was. His nickname was the Razor, and you can well imagine why. He was also a chain smoker. And he'd have one lid in his mouth and light up another. But actually, he was a very good general, though. I mean, he was the one who decided to attack the Chinese and defeated them at 3 major battles. So it wasn't dumb.
As we went about planning surface ships, I wonder if you've read Neptune's Inferno.
Yes.
It's a scary ship. I served 4 years on a cruise ship.
Did you?
And didn't know we were as vulnerable as it's come to light in Neptune's Inferno.
The Indianapolis was the classic example of a cruiser. A
Right.
wonderful cruiser. I don't know if any of you know the story of the Indianapolis. The Indianapolis was a cruiser in the United States Navy, and it was the one that carried the atomic bomb to Tinian. And it was on a secret mission. So it couldn't break radio silence. And they slipped out of Tinian without letting anybody know where they were going. Well, the Japanese torpedoed them, and the ship sank. What was it, about 1,200, 1,300 men?
700. 700 to the shore.
Yeah. And when they went into the water, nobody knew they were there. And the sharks ate about a third of them, killed about a third or more of them. It's a real tragic story. If you see the film Jaws, the first one, when you hear the shark killer, he talks about serving on the Indianapolis. Interesting stories that you see in films. Okay, you've been wonderful. Thank you so much. Just a handful of books. If any of you are interested, I'll be glad to sign and sell them.